September 24, 1866. The Glasgow Daily Herald, Glasgow, Scotland. Extraordinary Story of Hidden Treasure. A correspondent of the New York Herald writes, "Among the spots I have visited is a small island in Mahone Bay on the south coast of Nova Scotia, known as Oak Island, where, for over a century, has been centered quite an interest. I give you the story as 'twas told to me. Many years ago, when this province was a wild, blooming forest in summer and a bleak, snow-capped wilderness in winter, with here and there a small clearing from which arose the smoke of some hardy settler's hut, an old man resided in the then British colony of New England, whose life had been wrapped in mystery. He had been a sailor in his younger days, and people said he had been a soldier too, for upon his brown face there still remained traces of the cutlass. Often had the curious endeavored to sound him upon his early career, but it was a fruitless task. The old man was as mute as the rock regarding his history. At last, when people began to give up all hope of ever extracting his secret, the old cosmopolite was taken sick, and on his deathbed admitted that he had been one of Captain Kidd's rovers, that many years before he had assisted in burying over $4 million of gold beneath the soil of a secluded island east of Boston, the proceeds of Kidd's piracies. The death of this mysterious man and the secret he had divined were borne from lip to lip until Kidd and his hidden treasure became a household word among the settlers along the New England coast, who for years searched all the islands along the coast for some traces of the subterranean treasure vaults. But all these searches threw no light upon the buried treasure, and years rolled by, and people gave up the search. Nearly a quarter of a century later, 3 men named Smith, Vode, and McGinnis emigrated from New England and settled in Chester, Nova Scotia, Smith and McGinnis taking up land upon Oak Island. As soon as these men had erected their huts, they commenced their work of felling the forest that covered the island. McGinnis, while roaming over the island one day, was astonished to discover traces of former civilization, and upon pushing his explorations further, he discovered that the first growth of timber had been cut down, and that a second growth was springing up, while some stumps of oak that had fallen under some white man's axe were visible. Adjacent to this clearing stood an old giant oak, whose forked branches fell over the small clearing, and to the forked part of the oak, by means of a wooden trammel, converting the fork into a small triangle, was attached an old tackle block. Much he marveled, much he wondered, at these evidences of prior settlement, and away he went with Smith and Vode and reported his secret. The following day they visited the spot together, and on attempting to remove the block it broke to pieces, so decayed was it by age and exposure. While exploring the island, they found that the remains of a tolerably well-made road from it to the west shore of the island were still discernible, and part of the road is still seen. The first thought that struck them was that this was the island referred to by the dying sailor. The secluded situation of the island, the marks of former habitation, appeared in keeping with all they had heard of Kidd's hidden plunder. They were still more strongly impressed with this belief when they found that the ground over which the block and tackle hung had settled and formed a hollow. At once, the 3 pioneers set to work, clearing the young timber from the sunken ground and removing the surface soil for about 2 feet. They struck a tier of flagstones, evidently not formed there by nature. Subsequently, they ascertained that these stones were not indigenous to the island, but had been conveyed there from Gold River 2 miles distant. Removing the stones, the treasure seekers entered the mouth of an old pit or shaft that had been filled. The mouth of the pit was 7 feet in diameter, the sides of it being a tough, hard clay, but the earth with which it had been filled up was soft and loamy, and easily removed. Still, they descended the shaft foot by foot, discovering some new indication that increased their hopes of at last hitting the long-buried treasure. 10 feet from the surface, they struck a floor of solid oak logs, tightly attached to the sides, and below this, 2 feet of vacant space, caused by the tilling of the pit having settled down. They pushed their explorations 15 feet farther down, without striking the sought-for prize, and, after driving sticks into the mud, filled up the shaft and abandoned the work. Compelled to abandon the search for want of money, Smith and his associates endeavored to enlist the assistance of their neighbors and told their secret, but the people were poor and ignorant and laughed at them for attempting to find kids' money. 15 years passed without any further attempts being made to fathom the mystery of the old pit. At length, an old resident named Lynn heard the story of the pit, visited the island, examined the ground, and, believing these were the vaults of Kidd, went home and formed a company. Early in the following summer, they loaded a small schooner with tools and, arriving at Oak Island, commenced the search anew under the supervision of the 3 original discoverers. Digging down, they discovered the sticks planted by Smith and Vode, and 15 feet farther down they struck a second tier of oak logs. 10 feet farther down they struck a tier of charcoal, and 10 feet farther, or about 50 feet from the surface, a tier of putty. Farther down was a flagstone 1 foot by 2, with some rudely cut letters and figures upon it. They hoped this inscription would assist in solving the mystery, but they were unable to decipher it. At a depth of 90 feet, they found indications of water. At 93 feet, the water increased. Night coming on, they sank a crowbar down 5 feet and struck a hard, impenetrable substance found by the sides of the pit. Some supposed it was wood, others called it a chest. They quitted work for the night and returned home confident that with the morning sun, they would possess the long-sought treasure, and they discussed the question of its division. Morning settled the matter, however, for on repairing to work, they found 60 feet of water in the shaft. After futile attempts to bail the water out, pumps were put in, but these too failed. As they pumped out, the water still stood at the same level. The next step was to sink a new shaft beside the old one and tunnel from it under the old shaft in the hope of striking the money chest. When within 10 or 15 feet of the pit, the earth between the tunnel and pit gave way, and the water rushed in so rapidly that the men had barely time to retreat with their lives before 65 feet of water filled the tunnel and shaft. This placed a damper upon the energetic seekers after hidden treasure, and the work was given up after several £1,000s had been squandered in what some of the shareholders now began to think an ignis fatuus. 50 years glided into eternity before the work was renewed, yet the shafts and tunnels still remained full of water, which rose and fell with the ebbing and flowing of the tide in the bay, showing clearly that the island had been pierced by subterranean passages. This brings us down to a period of 15 years ago. A number of young men in the summer of 1848 proceeded to the island and renewed the work. They followed down the shaft of their predecessors when they encountered the same difficulty, water coming in upon them. After bailing it out, they pierced the bottom of the pit with a chisel and sledge-ball auger at a distance of 98 feet from the surface when they struck a hard wooden obstruction, which they confidently believed to be the money chest. The machinery brought up a bunch of something, which subsequently proved to be a grass peculiar to the Spanish Main. This gave the toilers new courage, and they followed up the discovery with renewed energy. The chisel having been attached to the auger, they cut through a spruce log about 6 inches thick when it dropped a foot and struck a piece of oak timber 4.5 inches thick. They soon found something harder than wood, and continued boring until the auger settled down about 20 inches. While passing through this substance, a sharp metallic sound greeted the ears of those employed. It resembled the noise a bar of iron would make on being wormed through a keg of nails, and the laborers were in ecstasies. There they were, within a few feet of Kidd's gold. 20 inches farther down more wood was found, and below it the same mineral substance. Then came wood again, and afterwards mud. The only thing taken out was part of the head of an oak cask. One end had been cut off, and the other exhibited the marks of the cooper's knife. Other bores were sunk near this one, but with the same results. Among other articles taken out was more Spanish grass, and part of the hoop of a barrel, with the bark in a good state of preservation. After making several bores with like results, and finding it impossible to keep down the water without an ample exchequer, they thought of the Dutchman and his anchor, and then, looking upon themselves and the treasure that lay hidden beneath them, many of the company withdrew from the work. The few who still persevered, from the fact that the water in the shafts fell and rose with the tide, became convinced that there were subterranean channels connecting the bay with the pit. Acting upon this belief, they searched the shore, when upon the east side of the cove they found 5 well-made drains entering the base of the island at low water mark. Removing the covering, to their surprise, they found that the stones forming the arch of the drains were coated with a cover of the Spanish grass. Further investigations showed that the drains had been run in the direction of the old pit, and considerable coconut fiber and Spanish grass were found as they progressed. They endeavored to follow the direction of the drains, but failed to find it connecting with a perpendicular shaft. The water soon rushed into the drain upon them. The next attempt was to sink a shaft and endeavor to strike this drain or channel in the line between the old pit and the entrance at the water. At a depth of 74 feet, water filled up the shaft. Several other shafts were sunk with the same result, and winter coming on, the work was abandoned until spring. Spring came, but the disappointed shareholders, some of whom had sunk their last dollar into the numerous piles, were disheartened, and the work was not renewed for 9 years. In the meantime, the charter of the company expired, and the seekers after Kidd's treasure returned to more profitable employment. Still, however, convinced that the treasure was there and accessible, if they could only stop the flow of water, so as to follow the old pit to its original bottom. The story of the excavations on Oak Island had in the meantime spread over the whole province, and there were hundreds who were disposed to make one more attempt to fathom the mystery. Accordingly, in 1861, meetings were held at various points in the province, full particulars of the enterprise laid before them, and stock to the amount of $2,000 subscribed. Several new pits were sunk, and tunnels run from them in the direction of the money pits, with the view of finding the subterranean channel that floods the pits. But after an expenditure of $1,200, the results were not satisfactory. The company, which now comprises some of the most influential gentlemen of Halifax, have increased their capital stock, and as a dernier resort are now building a dam round the base of the island for the purpose of cutting off the bay water from the subterranean channels, where they propose to pump the water out of the excavations already made and follow the channels to their terminus. The company feels sanguine that Kidd's 4 millions of gold are almost within their grasp. It is estimated that fully $100,000 have been expended already upon the search, and the present company, who are men of means, are determined to solve the mystery of Oak Island, if it costs as much more. Such is the history of the toilers of the Isle. All the members of the first 2 companies have passed away, and it remains to the 3rd generation to follow up the work of their ancestors. Should their expectations be realized, and I must admit the indications are good, what a remarkable mystery will be cleared up, and what a sensation produced. That a stupendous work of art has been constructed by unknown hands at Oak Island is a certainty. That most of the material used is indigenous to this country is also certain. What these works were constructed for, and by whom, and what they contain remain mysteries which, let us hope, will soon be cleared up.